A chilly November morning in 2019 began with an unusual commotion on the dirt road of East Prairie Lane in the suburbs of Lincoln, Nebraska. 6 unmarked police vehicles quietly pulled up in front of a modest single-story wooden house set apart among sprawling farm fields. Neighbors peeked through their curtains as tactical-clad officers fanned out and formed a perimeter around the property. Inside, 41-year-old Calvin Rhodes was making his morning coffee, a routine he had kept for more than a decade as a quiet, reserved mechanic who rarely socialized and almost never drew attention in the community. At exactly 7:11 a.m., a sharp knock echoed through the house. "Calvin Rhodes, Lancaster County Sheriff's Office. We have a subpoena for you in connection with the 2009 disappearance of Mara Ellison." Officers later described how Calvin's hand trembled slightly as he set down his coffee cup, yet his face remained strangely calm, as if he had been waiting for this moment for the past 10 years. Before we dive deeper into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you never miss the latest cases. The eastern suburbs of Lincoln, Nebraska in 2009 were a transitional stretch of land between scattered residential clusters and endless cornfields, where nighttime silence was broken only by wind whistling through old wooden fences. It was an area where city lights faded into a faint glow on the horizon, and any unusual movement was easily noticed because homes were sparse and open space dominated. In that setting, Mara Ellison spent the evening of the incident at her boyfriend Calvin Rhodes's house, a home close to the edge of farmland, far enough from downtown to escape the noise, but not so remote that it felt completely isolated. Neighbors who were still awake at the time reported hearing a loud argument coming from inside the house, loud enough to catch their attention, since such disturbances were rare in the neighborhood. The argument didn't last long. Afterward came an unnatural silence. No slamming doors, no sound of a car starting, no indication that anyone had left or returned. From that moment on, no one ever saw Mara leave the house or appear anywhere in the surrounding area. The next morning, when Mara was supposed to show up for work, she didn't. Calls from her family went unanswered. The fact that she never returned home, made no contact, and left no message immediately alarmed her relatives. They began searching the places she frequented: her best friend's apartment, her usual commute route, the stores she regularly visited, but there was no trace of her anywhere. As time passed without any new information about Mara's whereabouts, the family realized the situation was beyond their ability to handle alone and contacted the Lancaster County Sheriff's Office to report Mara Ellison missing, officially launching law enforcement involvement. Immediately after receiving the call, the Sheriff's Office duty team thoroughly documented everything the family provided: the exact time they lost contact with Mara, the locations already checked, and the results from each, as well as a description of Mara's personality, daily habits, and lifestyle to make an initial assessment of how unusual her disappearance was. From the family's initial statements, investigators quickly determined this did not appear to be a voluntary departure. Mara had no history of staying out overnight without telling anyone, no debts, no recent mental health crises or serious personal conflicts, and no planned trips that could explain her vanishing without contacting anyone. Missing work the next morning, not answering her phone, and leaving no indication of where she was going were all flagged as high-risk factors. During this intake phase, the Sheriff's Office began gathering the foundational data needed for the preliminary evaluation: Mara's usual daily schedule, fixed work hours, places she had visited in recent days, and close personal relationships that might shed light on her state before she disappeared. They also noted the status of Mara's relationship with Calvin Rhodes based on family input, along with the critical detail that Mara had been at Calvin's house the night of the incident, establishing him as the last known person to have contact with the victim. With this baseline information in hand, the Sheriff's Office compiled a priority list of individuals to contact first for initial verification and timeline reconstruction. Top of the list was Calvin Rhodes, the last person known to have seen Mara. Next were neighbors living near the scene who might have heard, seen, or noticed anything unusual around the time of the argument. The list also included several of Mara's co-workers and friends who had spoken to or seen her in the days leading up to her disappearance to establish her mental state and routine activities during that period. Creating this list allowed the investigators established a clear order for gathering information, enabling them to reconstruct the critical moments around the last confirmed sighting of Mara. All data was entered into the initial case file, forming the foundation for direct interviews with involved parties and allowing the investigation team to assess the case's risk level before moving to the next phase. Immediately after completing the intake from the family and building the initial witness list, the Lancaster County Sheriff's Office determined that the very first person who needed to be interviewed was Calvin Rhodes, the last known person to see Mara Ellison. Officers contacted Calvin directly and asked him to provide a full account of everything that happened the evening Mara stayed at his house. During that first interview, Calvin remained calm, neither evasive nor overly cooperative, an attitude investigators immediately noted for future evaluation of his willingness to assist. According to Calvin, the night before Mara vanished was nothing special except for a brief argument sparked by a personal disagreement. He said the fight was short, and afterward, Mara left the house upset, saying she needed time alone to think. When asked whether he actually saw her leave, in which direction, or at what exact time, Calvin only said he heard the door close and assumed she had walked out. When pressed on whether he visually confirmed her leaving, Calvin admitted he did not see her go and was only guessing based on the sound. This detail was flagged because it was inconsistent with what would be expected from the last person to see a missing individual, especially when that person never made any subsequent contact. When asked about the recent state of his relationship with Mara, Calvin described everything as relatively normal, acknowledging only minor disagreements and denying any serious conflict. However, information from Mara's family painted a different picture. They had heard Mara talk about tension in the relationship. That discrepancy was noted for deeper follow-up. Throughout the interview, Calvin steered answers toward the narrative that Mara left voluntarily in an emotional moment. He repeatedly said he believed she would come back soon and that her lack of contact was unexpected. Yet when officers asked for verifiable specifics about the last time he saw her, what she was wearing, what if anything she took with her, or any sign she was preparing to leave, Calvin provided nothing concrete. He kept repeating that he thought she just needed space and left without taking anything noteworthy. That claim raised another red flag. Leaving in the middle of the night, without a purse, keys, or phone, did not match the normal behavior pattern Mara's family had described. When asked why he didn't call Mara's family the next morning to check if she was safe, Calvin simply said he assumed she went home on her own and saw no reason to follow up. Another answer deemed inconsistent with the daily contact, typical of their relationship. Additionally, when asked to recount the argument in detail, Calvin gave a vague, generic version, lacking specifics about the topic, the trigger, or either person's behavior. His inability to pinpoint what escalated the situation enough for Mara to leave in the middle of the night was viewed as another inconsistency. Furthermore, when officers asked exactly where he was located after supposedly hearing the door close, Calvin's response was vague, saying he was in the kitchen, then moved to the living room, but unable to pin down his precise location at key moments immediately following the argument. All of these details were documented because they could directly affect the reconstruction of events right before Mara disappeared. Throughout the entire interview, Calvin never refused to answer, but his cooperation never rose above the bare minimum. He answered only what was asked, never elaborated, never volunteered extra information, and never resolved the contradictions in his own statements. After this first contact, investigators concluded that Calvin's account contained multiple inconsistencies with the family's information and with Mara's known behavior, and the timeline he provided had low verifiability due to the absence of direct observation. Everything was recorded in the report for cross-checking, verification, and assessing Calvin's level of involvement in subsequent investigative steps. After taking Calvin Rhodes's initial statement and noting the numerous inconsistencies in his description of the last time Mara Ellison was seen, the Lancaster County Sheriff's Office moved to the next standard step in a missing person case, launching a Phase 1 search of the area immediately surrounding the house where Mara had been that night. The property sat right on the edge of eastern Lincoln farmland and included a large backyard, footpaths leading into fields, and quiet dirt roads rarely traveled. The search team was divided into small groups, each systematically sweeping an assigned zone to ensure nothing suspicious was missed. In the backyard, officers examined the ground, bushes, and areas near the fence for any signs of disturbance or traces that Mara might have passed through after the argument. They paid special attention to spots where grass might be trampled or soft soil could hold footprints, but no clear evidence was found. Teams also swept the footpaths running from the backyard into the surrounding pasture and farmland, paths occasionally used by locals to move between plots or reach small structures like sheds or water pump stations. Because human traffic was light, fresh traces would normally stand out, yet no footwear impressions or dropped items linked to Mara were discovered. The search expanded to the edges of the tall grass fields encircling the residential pocket. These areas had high grass mixed with packed dirt and narrow trails, so investigators hoped any passage by the victim would have left visible disruption. However, because the search began several hours after the report and the area was exposed to strong wind, identifying traces became harder. Initial points of interest were examined closely, but yielded nothing concrete. The team also surveyed the dirt road connecting the neighborhood to nearby farmland, a logical route someone leaving Calvin's house on foot might take. Officers walked the entire reasonable length of the road, looking for footprints, tire tracks, or any unusual signs from the alleged time of the argument. Unfortunately, the dry dirt surface retained almost no impressions and no useful trace evidence was recovered. After completing Phase 1 and finding no direct evidence of Mara's presence or movement around the property, investigators concluded the search radius had to be expanded. The absence of traces in the immediate area left two main possibilities. Either Mara left the vicinity without leaving evidence, or the incident did not unfold as a simple voluntary departure as Calvin claimed. Both scenarios prompted the team to widen the search perimeter to include secondary roads, vacant lots, and more complex terrain farther from the house. All findings from the first search round were added to the case file to guide the next phase based on local geography and the evidence gathered so far. After completing the initial search of the immediate area surrounding the crime scene without recovering any direct traces related to Mara Ellison, the Lancaster County Sheriff's Office moved to the phase of establishing an initial timeline to reconstruct the full sequence of events in the period leading up to her disappearance. This step was considered critical in the preliminary verification stage, especially since the statement of the last known witness, Calvin Rhodes, contained numerous inconsistencies and lacked any independent evidence to support his account. To build the most accurate timeline possible in the context of incomplete information, authorities collected statements from multiple sources, starting with Mara's family. Relatives were questioned about Mara's recent activities, any changes in her attitude, mood, or daily habits, and the last time they had contact or saw her. The family confirmed that Mara had a stable work schedule, no major personal issues in the days before she went missing, and never mentioned any plans to go anywhere on the evening she visited Calvin's house. This information reinforced the initial assessment that Mara's sudden disappearance without notice was out of character for her. At the same time, police contacted neighbors living near Calvin's home to gather accounts from anyone who might have heard or seen something on the night of the incident. Several residents reported hearing an argument coming from Calvin's house for a relatively short period, describing the volume as loud enough to stand out in what is normally a quiet area. However, no one saw Mara leave the house or observed any movement that would suggest someone had departed immediately afterward. The fact that neighbors only heard sounds but had no visual confirmation forced investigators to treat those audio markers as temporary reference points, though they could not be considered evidence that Mara left the house as Calvin claimed. In addition to family and neighbors, Authorities continued working with Mara's acquaintances who had interacted with her in the days before her disappearance. Co-workers stated that she had shown up for all her shifts, displayed no signs of fatigue, stress, or notable personal conflicts. Close friends also confirmed that in recent conversations, Mara had not mentioned any plans for a temporary trip, had not spoken about being upset or wanting distance from anyone, and had expressed no concerns about her personal safety. This information was added to the case file for comparison with Calvin's statement, in which he claimed Mara left his house after their argument to calm down. Once statements from all relevant groups had been collected, investigators began arranging the data into a chronological sequence of events. Key markers included the time the family confirmed Mara left home to go to Calvin's, the time neighbors heard the argument, the subsequent period when the area became quiet again, the time the family began to worry when Mara did not return, and the time they checked familiar locations without finding any sign of her. During this process, police noted a significant gap between the time neighbors heard the argument and the time the family began trying to reach her, a period with no independent source confirming what Mara did, where she was, or whether she moved at all. That gap became a critical focus for further analysis because it marked the last phase in which Mara's presence could still be indirectly established through statements and actual sounds. Another gap appeared in Calvin's own account. He could not provide an exact time when he heard the door close or remember his own location inside the house immediately after the argument. These inconsistencies prevented investigators from confirming Mara's movements based on Calvin's statement alone, and from concluding that she had voluntarily left the house as he claimed. As a result, the period Calvin described became a data-deficient zone that needed to be filled with other sources, including potential cross-referencing with area cameras or physical evidence from the scene. From all the information gathered, authorities established a general timeframe to guide subsequent investigative steps. This timeframe included verifiable markers such as the time Mara arrived at Calvin's house, the time the argument was heard by neighbors, the time the family realized they could not reach her, and the time they reported her missing. Between these markers were two large gaps: the gap immediately after the argument and the gap from when Mara should have appeared at work until the family contacted police. These two gaps became the primary focus for investigators to search for clues by expanding evidence collection from the scene, related documents, and other supporting sources. By constructing the initial timeline with a clear separation between verified and unverified markers, the investigative team gained a foundation to direct the next measures aimed at narrowing the information gaps and more accurately reconstructing the events leading up to Mara Ellison's disappearance. After completing the initial timeline and clearly identifying the unexplained time gaps, the Lancaster County Sheriff's Office moved to an expanded search phase to sweep areas beyond the immediate vicinity of the scene, particularly the characteristic terrain of eastern Lincoln's suburbs, networks of dirt roads connecting farm fields, large cornfields, and sparsely populated rural zones. The absence of direct traces in the area immediately around Calvin Rhodes's house led authorities to conclude that if Mara Ellison had left that area, whether voluntarily or under duress, she most likely traveled, or was taken, along less traveled routes where traces could remain longer due to minimal human activity. Based on the terrain, the search team employed a grid search method, dividing the rural area into rectangular search blocks sized appropriately for real-world conditions, ensuring systematic coverage without missing any ground or trail. Teams were assigned to move in parallel lines, using stakes to mark completed sections, while paying close attention to the ground, weeds, low brush, and road edges, places where evidence could remain if the victim had passed through or been moved through. During the search, teams covered numerous rural roads leading away from the residential area, farm vehicle tracks, and temporary dirt roads connecting properties. These routes had uneven surfaces, with some soft soil or low grass sections where traces could persist longer. Despite the vast area, the search team maintained disciplined methodology, marking each completed zone and noting any suspicious points for possible re-examination. As teams moved deeper into adjacent cornfields, the search became more difficult due to limited visibility from tall corn and the straight row layout that could easily confuse direction. Teams moved slowly, walking each row and using landmarks to avoid missing gaps between rows. This type of agricultural terrain is known for its ability to conceal traces, especially in missing person cases involving movement through farmland. After many hours of grid searching, one team discovered the first item of evidence potentially directly related to Mara. The item was found at the edge of a corn row, several dozen meters from a dirt road, in a location unlikely to have ended up there naturally without human movement. The team immediately followed protocol, marking the discovery location, photographing the scene, recording coordinates, and drafting a seizure report. The goal at that moment was not immediate analysis or origin determination, but ensuring the item remained uncontaminated for later forensic examination. Given environmental factors, such as strong wind and open terrain, that could affect evidence preservation, the team used specialized tools to collect the item, avoiding direct hand contact to prevent contamination or chain of custody issues. After recovering the item, the surrounding area was expanded for further survey to check for additional related traces such as debris, scratch marks, footprints, or small personal items. Although no further evidence was found in the expanded zone, the location was flagged as a priority for re-examination if later investigative data showed a match with case developments. Beyond the discovery point, teams continued expanding to secondary rural roads, abandoned lots, and gaps between fields, areas easily overlooked from main roads. Rough or heavily vegetated sections were thoroughly checked to ensure nothing was missed. Locations showing compressed soil, broken grass, or altered paths were documented, even if insufficient for conclusions at the time. As the search radius grew, teams faced challenges from the sheer size of the area and the time required for thorough coverage. However, the recovered item provided a crucial reference point for comparison with other data. Authorities placed the item in an evidence bag, sealed it with a case number, and transferred it to the evidence processing unit for storage pending forensic analysis. This marked the first time in the search process that a specific physical clue, however small, had been found that could help narrow the investigation or corroborate related statements. All search teams returned to the staging area to compile data, cross-reference the discovery location with the established timeline, and document every completed grid section in detail. Although the single item could not yet confirm origin or direct relevance to Mara's disappearance, its discovery far from Calvin Rhodes's house added an important new avenue for authorities to consider when planning next steps. Given the vast and varied terrain of eastern Lincoln's rural areas, the evidence marker served as an anchor for redefining priority search zones in subsequent phases. After completing the expanded rural search and securing the first item of evidence potentially linked to Mara Ellison, the Lancaster County Sheriff's Office shifted to collecting data from available camera systems in the area to determine whether any footage could help establish the movements of persons of interest near the time of Mara's disappearance. Because the eastern Lincoln suburbs in 2009 lacked the dense surveillance coverage of downtown areas, the investigative team focused on locations most likely to have retained footage, gas stations along major roads, convenience stores with exterior cameras, and a limited number of private home security systems. The purpose of this step was not to prove criminal conduct immediately, but to gather as much raw video data as possible for cross-referencing with the previously established timeline. First, officers contacted owners of gas stations along the routes connecting Calvin Rhodes's neighborhood to surrounding rural areas. Although 2009 camera systems were of limited quality, many stations retained footage for a short period, allowing police to extract relevant segments. These recordings were reviewed to determine whether Calvin's vehicle appeared on the night in question. Frame-by-frame examination revealed several instances of a vehicle matching Calvin's description, including one segment showing it traveling from the direction of his house toward rural roads. The vehicle's presence was not direct proof of involvement in Mara's disappearance, but it provided a critical reference point for identifying routes Calvin may have used during the timeline gap. When compared to Calvin's statement that Mara left on foot immediately after their argument, police noted that Calvin's own travel at that time required closer scrutiny to determine its purpose, as his statement made no mention of leaving the house by car or traveling elsewhere. In addition to gas stations, the team collected camera data from convenience stores near major intersections and smaller roads leading to rural areas. These stores typically had cameras covering parking lots or entrances, enabling identification of personal vehicles at specific times. Some footage showed Calvin's vehicle passing through, but none captured Mara inside the vehicle or anywhere in frame. This both confirmed that Calvin's vehicle was on key roads the night of the incident and further highlighted the complete absence of any visual record of Mara after the argument. An anomaly if the Mara left on her own scenario described by Calvin were accurate. The team also contacted the few residents with private security cameras facing the street or front yard, though such systems were rare in the sparsely populated area. A handful of wide-angle cameras were checked, but poor nighttime image quality and low resolution made detail identification difficult. Nevertheless, all segments showing any notable movement within the relevant time frame were collected and backed up, as they could later be enhanced to reveal details not visible to the naked eye. When all camera sources were compiled, investigators determined that Calvin Rhodes's vehicle appeared at multiple locations directly relevant to the time of Mara's disappearance. No footage showed Mara on any road or leaving the area, and there was no indication of any unknown vehicle stopping in front of Calvin's house during the argument period. Although the recordings did not yet provide conclusive proof, they added a layer of supporting data to the timeline and helped narrow possible routes of travel. All collected videos were backed up and entered into the case evidence repository, complete with extraction timestamps and camera locations, preserving chain of custody for potential future enhancement using more advanced image processing technology to extract additional details from the older recordings. After completing the collection and evaluation of camera data in the area, the Lancaster County Sheriff's Office moved on to analyzing Mara Ellison's phone activity to add an independent layer of data supporting the established timeline. Since Mara was not carrying any dedicated GPS-enabled items, her cell phone became the only digital source capable of providing clues about the last location where her device connected to the cellular network before going completely silent. Phone records were obtained through the carrier she used at the time, including call logs, sent and received text messages, the last time the device was active, and related cell tower connection information. The retrieved data showed that in the period before Mara arrived at Calvin Rhodes's house, her phone was functioning completely normally. She received calls from family and sent a text to a coworker about the next day's schedule. There were no signs in the phone activity indicating that Mara intended to leave for an extended period or was under such stress that she wanted to cut off contact. This aligned with statements previously provided by family and coworkers. When examining activity after the last time Mara was seen, the phone data revealed one notable point. Her device generated no additional outgoing or incoming calls and no sent or received texts after the argument at Calvin's house. However, the phone remained connected to the network for a period afterward, which allowed investigators to roughly determine the area of the last cell tower connection. Analyzing 2009 cell tower data had significant limitations because the technology at the time only provided broad coverage radii and could not pinpoint locations as precisely as newer systems. Carrier records showed Mara's phone connected to one of the towers located in the eastern part of the city, near the boundary between residential and rural areas. That tower's coverage radius, however, extended for many kilometers, encompassing both the area near Calvin Rhodes's home and the rural roads that search teams had previously surveyed. This meant the cell tower data could not pinpoint the phone's exact location, but did help narrow down the possible direction of travel. When cross-referencing this data with the established timeline, police noted that the time of Mara's last phone connection coincided with the unexplained gap in Calvin's account. This was significant because if Mara had left Calvin's house exactly as he claimed, voluntarily and on her own, her phone would likely have continued moving and connected to multiple different towers in the area. Instead, the record showed only one final connection, after which the device went completely silent. This led authorities to consider the possibility that the phone either never left the coverage area of the recorded tower or was deliberately turned off very shortly after the last connection. When these findings were compared with the movement of Calvin's vehicle as captured on camera, investigators realized that the final coverage area of Mara's phone lay along the same geographic corridor as the route Calvin's vehicle was recorded traveling. Although this was not enough to prove any specific wrongdoing, the overlap between the phone data and the camera footage became a critical factor in re-evaluating the credibility of Calvin's statement. Officers also considered whether the unexplained gap in the timeline might coincide with the moment Mara's device stopped functioning. But the broad cell tower radius prevented a precise technical conclusion. Nevertheless, the fact that the phone ceased activity immediately after the last connection was deemed unusual, especially since family members stated Mara always kept her phone on, even when traveling at night. The sudden shutdown or complete loss of signal just hours after the argument was regarded as highly suspicious. All call, message, and cell tower data was extracted, backed up, and added to the investigative file, marking the completion of another important layer of information that would help further narrow the time and location of Mara Ellison's disappearance. After completing the analysis of Mara Ellison's phone activity and noting the significant overlap between the final signal area and the route captured on camera of Calvin Rhodes's vehicle, the Lancaster County Sheriff's Office moved to a comprehensive review of Calvin's full schedule before and after Mara's disappearance to assess the consistency of his behavior. This was a crucial step to compare Calvin's statement, which already contained several minor inconsistencies, with objective data such as financial transactions, personal appointments, and movement records during the critical time frame. First, authorities examined Calvin's work schedule in the days leading up to and following the incident. Calvin was a mechanic who worked rotating shifts with a somewhat irregular but usually pre-reported schedule when requesting time off or shift changes. Records showed he was present at work the morning of the day Mara came to his house, but there was no record of him clocking in or contacting his workplace the following day. When questioned, Calvin said he overslept and missed his morning shift, but the HR department confirmed he never reported his absence. This was the first point flagged by police, as the unexplained absence coincided with the time Mara's family began trying unsuccessfully to reach her. While Calvin's failure to show up for work did not directly prove involvement, it created an accountability gap in his normal routine that required further scrutiny. Next, investigators collected and cross-referenced Calvin's financial transactions, including card payments, cash withdrawals, and convenience store purchases. In the period before the incident, his transactions were routine, food purchases, fuel, and small everyday expenses. However, in the hours immediately after the argument, during the time Calvin claimed he stayed home trying to sleep, a transaction appeared at a convenience store several miles from his house. When asked about it, Calvin said he didn't really remember and might have gone out for something to drink. This explanation was noted as inconsistent and entirely absent from his initial statement, in which he insisted he never left the house after Mara walked out. The unreported trip undermined the reliability of his account and raised the possibility that he was concealing certain actions. Investigators further verified Calvin's movements by reviewing fuel purchase history, area surveillance footage, and the convenience store's own receipt records. One receipt showed Calvin buying items that were not inherently suspicious under legal standards, drinks and snacks, but the timing of the purchase coincided exactly with Mara's phone's final cell tower connection. This overlap prompted authorities to question whether Calvin was truly alone at that moment and whether his trip might be related to the sudden cessation of Mara's phone activity. Additionally, police reviewed Calvin's personal appointments that week and discovered he had canceled a previously scheduled repair appointment the day before the disappearance without giving a clear reason. When pressed, he said he was busy with personal matters but offered no further details. While not conclusive evidence, this fit a pattern of someone who may have been entering a situation that could lead to conflict or stress he wished to avoid discussing. A key part of the schedule review was identifying periods that could not be independently verified. When camera footage, financial transactions, and Calvin's statements were compared, investigators identified a significant gap from the time of the argument until Calvin appeared at the convenience store. During that window, no data placed him anywhere specific or confirmed his movements. This was the largest unaccounted-for period in Calvin's entire timeline and aligned directly with the moment Mara's phone went dark. His claim of staying home to rest was completely at odds with the objective evidence that he later showed up at the store. Investigators also evaluated Calvin's personal behavior in the hours and days that followed. Friends and coworkers described him as distracted and evasive when Mara's name came up, and he never proactively contacted her family to confirm she had left his house as he claimed. His initial reluctance to even acknowledge her absence was deemed abnormal. When all the collected data was considered together, including financial transactions that contradicted his statements, an unreported work absence, inconsistent accounts of his movements, and prolonged unaccounted-for periods, authorities concluded that Calvin not only showed signs of dishonesty, but was also the last person known to have been with Mara during the argument. Therefore, the schedule analysis concluded that Calvin Rhodes must be elevated to the primary suspect list. This determination was not based on any single piece of evidence, but on the cumulative weight of multiple discrepancies that formed a logical chain, demonstrating the unreliability of his account and the need for deeper scrutiny in subsequent investigative steps. After completing the analysis of Calvin Rhodes's schedule and confirming multiple unexplained gaps and unreported activities, the Lancaster County Sheriff's Office proceeded to a full review of Calvin's financial transactions in the 48-hour window before and after Mara Ellison's disappearance, searching for any unusual patterns that might relate to the case. The financial investigation was considered a vital supporting step to compare Calvin's behavior against his statements, since card payments, cash withdrawals, and purchase receipts create objective traces that are difficult to alter or explain away. Data obtained from his bank and the stores he frequented painted an overall picture of his financial activity during the critical period. In the 2 days before Mara arrived at his house, Calvin's transactions were normal: fuel purchases, fast food payments, and small grocery items. All were consistent with the daily routine described by coworkers and friends. However, immediately after the argument, during the time Calvin claimed Mara left on her own, the transaction records began showing inconsistencies with his account. The first was the previously noted convenience store purchase several miles from home, occurring while he insisted he was at home trying to sleep. The receipt showed only minor items, drinks and instant food that were not suspicious in themselves, but the timing matched the exact moment of Mara's final cell tower ping, raising questions about why he left the house and whether he was truly alone as claimed. When confronted, Calvin again said he didn't really remember, a response flagged as illogical, given that financial transactions typically leave a clear impression, especially when someone is supposedly home alone after an argument. In a deeper review of the following day's transactions, investigators discovered a purchase at a hardware and repair supply store located near the rural eastern area. The items bought included large trash bags, rubber gloves, and heavy-duty cleaning chemicals. Individually, each item was neutral and could be used for ordinary household purposes, but the combination was distinctive enough to be flagged for monitoring, especially since Calvin never mentioned any cleaning or repair projects during that time. When questioned, he said he was cleaning the house, a vague explanation that did not align with the fact that he skipped work that morning, made no contact with Mara's family, and had no other social activity that day. Moreover, the store was located along the same geographic corridor where search teams later recovered items belonging to Mara, making the purchase even more noteworthy. Investigators also identified a fuel purchase made around the time camera footage showed Calvin's vehicle leaving the residential area. Calvin's statement that he only left the house once that night to get some air did not match the recorded fuel volume, leading police to suspect he may have driven farther than admitted and possibly used roads not covered by area cameras. Taken together, these transactions heightened scrutiny of Calvin's small but suspicious behaviors. No single purchase constituted direct incriminating evidence, but collectively, they formed a pattern inconsistent with the behavior of someone entirely uninvolved in the disappearance. The presence of transactions that contradicted his statements, combined with timing overlaps with Mara's phone data and vehicle camera footage, led authorities to compile a formal list of suspicious transactions for continued follow-up. The list included all post-argument purchases, especially those involving items potentially related to cleaning, transport, or disposal. Any transactions during periods he claimed he never left the house, and any purchases along the same travel corridor shown in the camera evidence. All financial data was sealed and entered into the investigative file to support ongoing behavioral cross-checking, enabling the sheriff's office to further narrow the scope of suspicion and objectively assess Calvin Rhodes's level of involvement based on financial traces that are extremely difficult to alter or reinterpret. After completing the review of Calvin Rhodes's unusual financial transactions and compiling the contradictions between his statements and objective data, the Lancaster County Sheriff's Office determined that the field search needed to be expanded further to examine areas that could potentially have been used to conceal or dispose of evidence related to Mara Ellison's disappearance. Given the terrain of the rural east side of Lincoln, this area contains numerous abandoned agricultural structures, barns, sheds, old warehouses, and auxiliary buildings that fell out of use as farming operations changed over time. These locations are typically isolated, see little traffic, and because of their abandoned state, could serve as sites where traces might remain if the victim had ever been taken there. The search teams were mobilized and again divided into multiple groups to systematically check each structure on a list compiled from topographic maps, local agricultural records, and tips provided by residents. Old barns and warehouses along large fields were prioritized first, as many of them lie close to the dirt roads that appeared in the route analysis of Calvin's vehicle. At each structure, the teams conducted a full inspection of the entire building, including the ground surface, doors, areas around the walls, nearby brush, and any spot that might show signs of disturbance. Long-abandoned buildings often have a thick layer of dust on surfaces, and the soil beneath is easily marked by compression if there has been recent activity. So the teams paid particular attention to any areas showing signs of disturbance. In several old barns, the search teams discovered trampled areas that did not fully match the movement patterns of local wildlife and appeared to have been made around the time Mara went missing. However, because there were no distinguishing features such as shoe prints or dropped items, these traces were simply documented for overall evaluation and could not yet serve as direct evidence. Similarly, in some smaller sheds located deeper in the fields, teams found soil that had been disturbed near the entrances, but no physical evidence related to the victim was present at those spots. Soil disturbance can result from occasional animal activity or weather effects, so investigators did not jump to conclusions. They only noted the locations and times of inspection for future comparison. Additionally, in a few structures, teams located ordinary items such as drink cans, plastic bags, or broken pieces of wood, but nothing indicated a connection to the disappearance. Although these buildings yielded no direct results, searching them allowed investigators to rule out the possibility that the victim had been present at those locations around the time of the incident. As teams moved deeper into the broader agricultural area, they continued checking old earthen warehouses previously used for machinery storage. At one of them, the team discovered faint tire tracks leading into an area of soft ground, but the tracks were not clear enough to identify the vehicle type or the time they were made. The tire marks were photographed, measured, and documented for comparison if additional vehicle data emerged during the investigation. However, since there was no direct evidence linking the tracks to Calvin or Mara, this discovery was classified only as an undetermined trace. In addition to the larger structures, teams also examined smaller ones, such as pumping stations, old fertilizer storage sheds, and areas around disused grain bins. Some locations showed flattened grass or unusual depressions in the soil, but after thorough examination, no conclusive signs were found. Strong winds and variable weather in Nebraska erase or distort many surface traces, making evaluation even more difficult. After completing the inspection of all agricultural structures identified within the initial reasonable search radius, the search teams compiled all noted suspicious points and reported them to the command center. Although no direct physical evidence related to Mara Ellison was obtained, all teams agreed that the vast and complex rural terrain required the search area to be further expanded if any risk of missing clues was to be minimized. Based on the scattered but potentially valuable findings, authorities proposed extending the search to more distant areas, including secondary dirt roads and agricultural structures outside the original sweep, to ensure maximum coverage in the next phase of the investigation. After finishing the intensive search of abandoned agricultural buildings yet still obtaining no decisive traces, the Lancaster County Sheriff's Office conducted a full evaluation of the entire investigation and search process from the moment the case was reported to the present stage. The search teams, data analysis teams, and statement cross-checking teams all submitted comprehensive reports detailing what had been done. The first-round search around Calvin Rhodes' home, expansion into rural areas and cornfields, sweeps of abandoned structures, review of area surveillance footage, examination of Mara Ellison's phone activity, and investigation of Calvin's schedule, finances, and behavior during the relevant period. Although numerous measures had been carried out systematically and thoroughly, the results still showed that no direct discovery proved Mara had left the last place she was seen or left clear traces along the routes the teams had searched. In the submitted reports, all teams agreed that a large amount of information had been collected, but most of it was only indirect, reflecting unusual behavior by Calvin Rhodes rather than specific indicators of Mara's location or condition. The absence of any direct eyewitness was one of the most serious limitations of the case. Neighbors around Calvin's house only heard arguing. None observed any actions related to Mara leaving or being taken away. Area cameras also captured no images of her after the argument. All data regarding Mara's presence ends at the point of the sounds the neighbors heard. After that, there are no further accounts or images of her. The complete lack of direct eyewitnesses made accurate reconstruction of events nearly impossible. Regarding physical evidence, the search team had recovered one small item in the cornfield area, but in 2009 forensic analysis capabilities were limited. There was no usable DNA, no easily analyzed biological traces, and the item lacked sufficient evidentiary value to link it directly to Mara under the technical standards of that time. Even when cross-referenced with Calvin's statements, the item did not meet the threshold needed for charges or investigative conclusions. The traces found in barns, sheds, or warehouses were merely soil disturbances or trampling of unclear origin and could not be proven related to the victim. The camera and digital data team concluded that no footage provided specific information. Most videos were blurry, lacking detail and body heat, or silhouettes could not be identified. Mara's phone provided only a final cell tower connection in an area too broad for precise location inference. Even though Calvin's movement and financial data contained numerous anomalies, they only created strong suspicion, not enough legal weight for charges, or to move the case into full criminal investigation. When all data from the teams was compiled, the sheriff's office recognized that despite deploying many different search and analysis approaches, the case still lacked three critical elements needed to advance: no body, no direct eyewitness, and no physical evidence sufficient for prosecution under 2009 standards. These conditions meant the file could not continue active expansion without new data. The formal evaluation meeting concluded that current investigative avenues had reached their feasible limit. There were no new leads for continued field searches, no new technical data for deeper analysis, and no new witnesses coming forward. Continuing the investigation under these circumstances would only waste resources without producing real progress. Based on the criteria of the prosecutor's office and Nebraska's procedures for long-term missing persons cases, Mara Ellison's file was recommended for transfer to the cold case unit, unsolved cases that can be reopened when new technology or information becomes available. This decision did not mean the case was abandoned, rather it meant suspending active investigation and moving the file to monitored storage, where it would be periodically reviewed and ready for immediate reactivation if any new data emerged in the future. After approval, all investigative documents, collected evidence and analysis reports were sealed according to protocol and placed in Lancaster County's cold case storage, officially marking the point at which Mara Ellison's disappearance entered a state of prolonged impasse. 10 years after Mara Ellison's disappearance was placed on the cold case list and stored in the Lancaster County Sheriff's Office without any progress, the landscape of criminal investigative technology in 2019 had changed dramatically. Advances in trace DNA analysis, image restoration technology, and modern evidence management systems prompted many backlog cases to be re-examined for potential reactivation. Nebraska's cold case unit, the division responsible for handling unresolved files, began reviewing its list according to new criteria, case severity, feasibility with modern forensic techniques, and the existence of original evidence still intact in storage. Mara Ellison's disappearance stood out on this list for two notable reasons. First, the original investigation had collected small items of evidence that could not be adequately analyzed in 2009. Second, all of that evidence had been fully sealed and remained in excellent storage condition, creating an opportunity for re-evaluation using new generation forensic methods. When the cold case unit's analysts reviewed the original files, they noted that although the initial investigation had been quite thorough, technological limitations at the time prevented most evidence from yielding useful test results. In the 2019 forensic context, those small items, fibers, material fragments recovered from the cornfield, or trace surface samples, became highly promising because newer techniques could extract DNA, skin cells, or biological compounds with far greater sensitivity than 2009 technology allowed. Recognizing the match between the evidence storage conditions and new analytical capabilities, the cold case unit decided to reopen Mara Ellison's file for a complete reassessment of all data. The first step in reactivating a cold case is a comprehensive review of the original file. Investigators reopened the documents, including scene reports, the initial timeline, witness interview transcripts, area camera data, cell tower information, and records from the expanded rural searches. Each document was examined to identify weaknesses in the old investigative reasoning and strengths that could be re-exploited with new methods. Many reports that had previously been merely noted were now re-evaluated from a modern forensic perspective, especially the records of evidence that could not be tested in 2009. Investigators also paid renewed attention to the documented unusual behavior of Calvin Rhodes, which had been recorded in the old file but lacked sufficient weight to become prosecutable evidence at the time. Although no new conclusions were reached yet, re-examining these points of suspicion helped the cold case unit form an overall picture of the case's nature and confirmed that if new forensic data could be extracted from the evidence, they would have grounds to reassess all previously noted inconsistencies. After completing the file review, the next step was inventorying the original evidence to determine preservation quality and suitability for modern forensic testing. The evidence management section opened the sealed cold case vault and released the items related to Mara Ellison's disappearance, including evidence recovered from the cornfield area, soil samples possibly containing skin cells, small objects found near the scene, and samples taken from disturbed locations in the rural areas. Overall preservation condition was rated good, thanks to standard storage procedures and the fact that the case had never gone to trial, so evidence had not been moved repeatedly. Cold case unit forensic specialists examined each item individually, assessing integrity, seal condition, and applicability of new testing techniques. The majority of items met requirements for further testing, particularly the samples that were too small for old technology to extract DNA from. These could now be analyzed using trace surface brushing or residual organic compound analysis. After reviewing all evidence, the cold case unit created a detailed list categorizing items as priority for immediate testing, testable but not urgent, and unsuitable due to quality or storage condition. The priority list focused on items likely to contain trace biological material, such as the fabric fragment found in the cornfield, because they could yield DNA results even at very low molecular levels. Some soil samples and objects from barn and shed locations were also placed in the testable category because they might carry skin cells, protein markers, or biological compounds associated with human skin. Creating this evidence list clearly showed the cold case unit's objective to use modern forensic technology to generate new data, thereby opening pathways to reevaluate the entire case. Although no conclusions had been reached at the time of file reactivation, selecting which items to retest marked a critical starting point, laying the foundation for potentially reviving the investigation after a decade during which Mara Ellison's disappearance had remained deadlocked. After the cold case unit completed compiling the list of evidence items requiring priority retesting, the unit's forensic department began conducting the analyses using 2019-era technological standards, with the primary focus being touch DNA techniques and micro-extraction methods capable of recovering extremely small biological traces that had remained on the evidence since 2009. At the time of the original 2009 investigation, these items had yielded no investigative value because the biological content was too low. The extraction equipment lacked sufficient sensitivity, and the analytical processes had not yet reached the threshold required to identify DNA from shed skin cells. However, thanks to more than a decade of advances in forensic technology, items that had once been classified as insufficient for analysis now represented the case's most promising potential sources of information. The forensic team began with the most critical item recovered from the cornfield area, a small fabric fragment located at the exact position the 2009 grid search team had documented. The fragment was examined under a microscope and determined likely to contain adhered epidermal cells. Using touch DNA techniques, the forensic specialist performed micro-extraction of the cells present on the item's surface. The process required many hours of extraction, amplification and sensitivity enhancement in order to obtain a DNA quantity sufficient for profiling. When the first results came back, the laboratory confirmed the presence of a mixed DNA sample containing multiple contributors, one portion of unknown origin, while the remainder could be compared against DNA profiles already on file from individuals connected to the case. Because the 2009 case file still retained DNA reference samples from Calvin Rhodes and several of Mara's relatives for exclusion purposes, the forensic team immediately entered the mixed sample into the comparison protocol. The results revealed that, in the portion of the sample showing the clearest amplification, a genetic profile matching Calvin Rhodes was present at multiple key loci. Even more significantly, the strength of that match went beyond ordinary contact transfer. It indicated Calvin's presence at a location entirely inconsistent with the account he gave in 2009. In his original statement, Calvin insisted he never left the house after the argument and absolutely did not go to the cornfield area where the item was recovered. Yet the touch DNA result placed his DNA directly on the fabric fragment, meaning the fabric had come into direct or indirect contact with Calvin under circumstances sufficient to deposit biological trace. This became the pivotal point that rendered Calvin's statement unreliable. The forensic team continued analyzing the remaining priority items. A soil sample collected from the soft ground near an abandoned barn, a location noted during the 2009 search, was also subjected to trace analysis. Within that soil, the team detected human epidermal cells, most likely shed from skin during forceful contact with the rough surface. After amplification, the resulting DNA profile showed partial concordance with Calvin Rhodes' genetic record. Although this sample was weaker, exhibited lower amplification, and was not strong enough for absolute identification. The fact that two separate items from two distinct locations both revealed Calvin's DNA outside the area he claimed to have remained in drew sharp attention from the cold case unit. Among the remaining evidence, the team also examined a small piece of material recovered near an eastern dirt road, where the 2009 search team had suspected ground disturbance. Although this item did not contain sufficient DNA for a full profile, several organic compounds associated with human surface contact could still be extracted. The recovered proteins and cellular material were compared, and while they did not produce a complete profile, multiple markers still displayed similarity to Calvin Rhodes' biological reference sample. Taken together, these results painted a far clearer forensic picture than anything possible in 2009, where evidence had previously yielded only vague data unusable for comparison. Modern technology now enabled the recovery of traces invisible to the naked eye. With Calvin's DNA appearing on at least two widely separated rural items, including one location well outside the radius around his home, and coinciding with an area the search team had flagged for disturbance, the cold case unit concluded this constituted the first genuine breakthrough of the reinvestigation phase. These traces carried not only scientific weight, but logical weight. If Calvin's 2009 account were accurate, his DNA had no reason to be present at those points. Conversely, if Calvin was physically present at those locations during the unexplained gap in the timeline, his potential involvement in Mara's disappearance became dramatically more probable than previously believed. In addition to the field evidence analyses, the laboratory also re-examined several samples collected from Calvin's residence in 2009. Although storage conditions had imposed limitations, many samples remained of sufficient quality for the new microanalysis techniques. While these did not yield DNA directly linked to Mara, the retesting ruled out contamination or mixing during the original 2009 collection process, confirming that the positive Calvin hits originated from the outdoor evidence items rather than from initial collection procedures. When all results were compiled, the cold case unit determined that the discovery of Calvin's DNA on off-site evidence represented a game-changing development. For the first time in over a decade, Mara Ellison's disappearance now possessed verifiable forensic data, breaking the stalemate that had persisted since 2009. Not only did it prove Calvin had been in places he denied, the forensic findings provided a foundation for challenging his statements, reconstructing his movements on the night in question, and re-evaluating the likelihood of his direct involvement in Mara's disappearance. This was regarded as the first and most important breakthrough of the reinvestigation phase, opening the door to deeper analysis of the connections among physical evidence, movement data, and behavior during the previously unresolvable critical time window. After the 2009 evidence yielded forensic results showing Calvin Rhodes' DNA at locations he had denied visiting, the cold case unit shifted to re-evaluating all original surveillance footage. The video segments extracted from gas stations, convenience stores, and several residential cameras had been reviewed in 2009, but provided no clear value due to poor quality, low light, and the limited resolution of recording equipment available at the time. By 2019, the team recognized that advances in digital image enhancement technology now made it possible to re-exploit those old footage in ways that were impossible 10 years earlier. They therefore retrieved the original, uncompressed copies of the videos from evidence storage and from the investigating agency's legacy archives, ensuring no copies had been degraded through compression. Retrieval was time-consuming because data had to be recovered from outdated storage devices, some of which were no longer natively compatible with modern systems. Once the video files were fully restored, the cold case unit's image analysis team applied next-generation enhancement software capable of adjusting brightness, reducing background noise, reconstructing object edges, and performing advanced motion analysis. Although the original goal was simply to determine whether clearer images could reveal Calvin's vehicle direction, the team quickly realized the enhanced footage was dramatically sharper than the original blurry recordings. In one segment captured by a camera mounted outside a gas station on the rural eastern route out of Lincoln, previously showing only a vague silhouette of Calvin's vehicle passing by, image enhancement brought the interior cabin contours into relief. After adjusting contrast parameters and applying object shape reconstruction algorithms, analysts discovered a human figure seated in the front passenger seat. Though the face was not discernible, the body size was consistent with that of an adult woman. Motion analysis further revealed the figure was positioned slightly toward the window, sitting passively with no active movement throughout the time the vehicle was in frame. In the 2009 record, Calvin Rhodes stated he left the house alone after the argument and that Mara Ellison had walked out by herself in an angry state. Yet the 2019 enhanced footage showed Calvin's vehicle cabin was not empty, and the size, body proportions and seated posture matched the average build of Mara Ellison as described in her personal file. Although the image lacked sufficient resolution for facial identification, the result directly contradicted Calvin's claim of having driven alone. The team cross-checked every available angle in the clip to ensure the conclusion was not due to lighting artifacts or geometric distortion. After multiple rounds of calibration, reconstruction and algorithmic measurement of object dimensions, they confirmed the passenger seat silhouette possessed shoulder width, body ratio, and relative height consistent with Mara Ellison when seated. The timestamp of the vehicle placed it within the unexplained gap in the timeline, a period during which Calvin had been unable to provide consistent statements. When combined with the earlier DNA findings that already placed Calvin at denied locations, the investigators concluded that the 2009 camera footage, once enhanced with 2019 technology, constituted the first digital evidence demonstrating a major inconsistency in Calvin's account. Notably, the video showed Calvin's vehicle traveling the same route as the areas where 2009 search teams had recovered evidence, further strengthening the linkage between camera data and physical items. Upon completion, all enhanced videos were preserved to evidentiary standard, backed up, and accompanied by detailed analytical reports describing the algorithms used and the degree of enhancement applied, an obligatory step to maintain admissibility in future proceedings. With the restored 2009 footage now clearly showing the presence of a person whose build matched Mara Ellison in Calvin Rhodes' passenger seat, the cold case unit concluded they had acquired another critical piece of evidence, reinforcing the assessment that Calvin's 2009 statements did not align with reality. After the 2009 videos, restored using 2019 technology, revealed that Calvin Rhodes' vehicle was carrying a passenger whose build matched Mara Ellison, the cold case unit moved to the next phase, fully reconstructing Calvin's route on the night of the incident. This stage was crucial because only by establishing an accurate or near-accurate path and potential stopping points could authorities directly correlate the 2009 field evidence with the new digital findings. The data analysis team began by extracting all cell tower records for both Calvin's and Mara's phones from the night in question. Although Mara's phone went dark early, its final connection to a specific tower provided an important marker. As for Calvin's phone, despite his claim that he stayed home most of the time after the argument, the tower logs showed his device connecting to multiple different towers that night, a pattern possible only if the phone traveled through several coverage sectors. Thanks to algorithmic advances in signal analysis developed over the intervening decade, the cold case unit was able to reconstruct the device's probable path by cross-referencing signal strength, sector angle, and connection timing. While not as precise as modern GPS, the method was sufficiently robust to map the journey in broad segments and identify areas the device likely passed through. When the tower data was fed into the system, the algorithm revealed a movement pattern extending from the area around Calvin's house eastward into deeper rural territory. Of particular note, one intermediate connection point fell within very close proximity to the location where the 2009 search team had recovered the first major item of evidence, the fabric fragment at the edge of the cornfield. This coincidence prompted the team to investigate whether Calvin had stopped in that area or merely drove past. To clarify, they integrated the tower data with the enhanced camera footage. One restored gas station clip showed Calvin's vehicle traveling noticeably slower than the route's average speed, raising the possibility he was looking for a turn or preparing to enter a dirt road. The reduced speed, while not conclusive of intent, occurred precisely during the time frame that matched the tower signal, allowing investigators to seriously consider the likelihood of an off-main road stop. As the cell tower model was further refined using path simulation algorithms, the system generated an elliptical zone of interest extending along the dirt road into the eastern cornfield. The team identified 3 high-probability stop locations, one near the field entrance, one near the site where the fabric fragment was found, and one adjacent to the abandoned barn. These points were then overlaid on the 2009 search maps that had noted minor disturbances such as churned soil, flattened grass, and indistinct tire marks. One of the suspected tower points aligned almost perfectly with an area the 2009 team had documented as showing unexplained soil disturbance near the abandoned barn. The soil sample from that exact spot had already produced new forensic results, revealing partial match epidermal cells to Calvin. The convergence of modern digital data with 2009 physical evidence created a focal point, the cold case unit, deemed worthy of intense scrutiny. When the 3 data streams, cell tower records, enhanced video, and physical items were synthesized, the cold case unit concluded that the eastern zone between the dirt road into the cornfield and the abandoned barn represented the highest probability location where Calvin stopped and exited his vehicle on the night in question. Although exact stop duration could not be pinpointed from the blurry images and signal data, the algorithmic analysis indicated Calvin's phone remained connected to the same rural tower long enough to be classified as a stop rather than mere passage. From this determination, the cold case unit designated the area as the primary target for renewed physical search. Because every strand of digital and physical evidence now pointed to it as the likely site of a critical action related to Mara Ellison's disappearance. By combining modern signal analysis technology, enhanced 2009 camera footage, and the original field documentation, the investigators had finally identified a specific high suspicion zone, one that, at the time of the original case, could not have been targeted due to technological limitations. That breakthrough became the decisive factor in choosing this location as the focal point for re-examination in search of additional traces tied to Calvin's movements on the night Mara vanished. After identifying the area between the dirt road leading into the cornfield and the abandoned barn as the location with the highest probability that Calvin Rhodes had stopped on the night Mara Ellison disappeared, the cold case unit launched a much larger scale re-examination of the site than the searches conducted in 2009. This area was delineated based on the convergence of cell tower data, enhanced security camera footage, and trace evidence analyzed during the 2019 forensic phase, creating a suspect point strong enough to justify excavation and stratigraphic examination. The crime scene team employed stratigraphic markers, magnetometers, and hand-digging tools to avoid damaging any trace evidence that might still exist in the agricultural soil layers. The surface was first cleared of weeds and the thin layer of vegetation removed. Then each soil layer was lifted in stratigraphic sequence to check for differences in compaction, soil color, and anomalous materials. The ground nearest the abandoned barn, where disturbance had been noted in 2009 but lacked sufficient data for follow-up, was prioritized for excavation. As early as the second soil layer, the excavation team noticed structural differences. This layer showed uneven compaction, indicating the surface may have been disturbed at some point in the past. Soil samples were carefully collected, sealed, and labeled for transfer to the forensic lab. As digging continued deeper, investigators recovered several fabric fibers mixed into the soil layer, fibers whose color and material matched clothing Mara was known to wear based on family descriptions and personal records from the 2009 case file. Because these fibers were protected beneath overlying soil, the likelihood that they had fallen from a passerby or resulted from farming activity was extremely low. Immediately upon discovery, The experienced team used specialized forceps to collect each fiber individually, avoiding fingerprints or contamination. When the excavation was expanded toward the softer ground near the foundation, where disturbance had also been documented in 2009, the search team located an additional small personal item, a thin piece of plastic, believed to be a fragment of a fake fingernail or nail decoration. Mara's family had previously stated that she regularly wore acrylic nails as part of her personal style, but samples recovered in the rural area in 2009 had been too degraded for conclusive matching. With 2019 material analysis technology, the cold case unit assessed that the new evidence had a high probability of belonging to Mara. Another notable discovery was a small depression in the compacted soil that matched the general shape of a shoe print, though it was not sharp enough to identify a sole pattern. However, the orientation of the impression aligned with the movement direction reconstructed by the cell tower algorithm, suggesting the print may have been made at the same time Calvin's device was within that tower's coverage area. Although the impression could not serve as conclusive evidence, it was added to the evidentiary chain for cross-referencing. All new evidence, fabric fibers, the nail fragment, soil samples, and the shoe impression, was transported to the forensic laboratory for analysis. Using modern techniques, the fabric fibers recovered from the stratigraphic layer exhibited synthetic characteristics that matched the type of material used in shirts Mara was known to wear according to friends' statements and personal photos. The acrylic nail fragment also displayed a polymer structure similar to the type Mara had purchased, based on a 2009 receipt from a nail salon that police had obtained while constructing the original timeline. When the new evidence was compared with the 2009 evidence, the cold case unit saw a clearer picture emerge. Both the 2009 and 2019 items appeared in the same previously identified disturbed area, an area that coincided with the stop location reconstructed from cell tower analysis, and forensic DNA results confirmed Calvin's presence at the same site. A logical chain began to form. Calvin was present where Mara's items were found, at a time that matched the gap in his alibi. His vehicle was recorded carrying a passenger whose build matched Mara's. The new evidence was buried in the soil strata at the exact location where Calvin's phone had stopped according to cell tower data. When these elements were synthesized, the cold case unit concluded that the new evidence was not merely suggestive, it directly implicated Calvin in the movement or disposal of the victim at that location. Although the full sequence of events remained undetermined, the complete evidentiary chain, for the first time in 10 years, allowed investigators to focus clear suspicion on Calvin Rhodes and opened the way for the next phase of the reinvestigation into Mara Ellison's disappearance. After completing analysis of all new evidence recovered from the key area and cross-referencing it with older evidence, the cold case unit determined that the forensic data chain, including Calvin Rhodes' DNA at a location he had denied visiting, items directly linked to Mara Ellison buried in the soil layers, and enhanced camera footage showing his vehicle carrying a passenger matching Mara's build, had reached the threshold required to conduct a formal interview under caution. Accordingly, Calvin was summoned to the investigative office for further questioning under cold case unit supervision. The summons took place within a clear legal framework, with the intent of giving Calvin an opportunity to explain the newly emerged inconsistencies. When confronted with the chain of evidence, Calvin appeared shocked by the level of detail in the forensic analysis. Initially, he attempted to repeat his original 2009 statement that he never left the house except once to get some air, and that Mara left on her own, but investigators presented the DNA report proving his presence at the key rural site, an area he had never mentioned in any statement over 10 years. When asked to explain why his DNA appeared in soil samples, on physical items, and at a location far from his home, Calvin offered no consistent explanation. Vague responses, such as "maybe I walked through there once," or "it could be a lab mix-up," were quickly refuted. When investigators presented the 2019 standard touch DNA extraction and comparison protocols that ruled out cross-contamination. Next, the team showed Calvin the enhanced camera images clearly depicting a passenger in his truck's cab. Although the face was not identifiable, the build, shoulder width and posture were entirely inconsistent with his claim of driving alone. When pressed for an explanation, Calvin continued to deflect, claiming the image is grainy. But the imaging unit had prepared a technical report detailing the enhancement process and confirming that the figure in the passenger seat was neither a light reflection nor digital artifact. The confrontation grew more intense when investigators presented the newly recovered fabric fibers and acrylic nail fragment, along with forensic reports showing compatibility with Mara's clothing and personal habits. Calvin could offer no reasonable explanation for why items belonging to Mara were recovered at a location he had visited during the exact window confirmed by cell tower records showing his phone had stopped there. When the full chain of evidence was laid out in logical sequence, Calvin's DNA at the scene, Mara's items in the vehicle stop area, camera proof he was not alone, and a decade of inconsistent statements, Calvin fell into prolonged silence and refused to answer further questions. Following procedure, investigators informed him of his right to have counsel present before the interview continued. After Calvin's attorney arrived, the confrontation resumed, but no explanation was offered that could break the interconnected strength of the new evidence chain. Based on Calvin's inability to provide statements consistent with the forensic data, combined with verified digital and physical evidence, the cold case unit submitted the file to the Lancaster County Prosecutor's Office, requesting an arrest warrant. The prosecutor determined that the new evidentiary chain met the legal threshold and issued a formal arrest warrant for Calvin Rhodes on charges directly related to the disappearance of Mara Ellison. Once the warrant was approved, the investigative team executed the arrest using standard safety protocols. Calvin was taken into custody at his residence without resistance, and the entire arrest was recorded to ensure full legal compliance. He was transported to the county detention center for further processing. The issuance of the arrest warrant and Calvin's pre-trial detention marked the most significant breakthrough since the case was reopened. The first time in 10 years since Mara vanished that authorities had an official suspect supported by a coherent chain of forensic, digital, and physical evidence that could not be ignored. After Calvin Rhodes was arrested and charged in connection with the death of Mara Ellison, the case quickly proceeded to trial in a special proceeding classified as a nobody homicide, a rare type of case in which the entire prosecution must rest on a tightly linked chain of circumstantial evidence rather than the victim's remains. At trial, the prosecution systematically presented the full timeline of evidence accumulated over 10 years, emphasizing that although no body had been recovered, the forensic data, digital records, and physical items aligned consistently and could not be explained by any innocent hypothesis. The prosecution's chain began with the 2019 enhanced camera footage, proving Calvin's truck was not alone on the night of the incident, directly contradicting his 2009 statement. Next came the touch DNA results, placing Calvin's biological traces at the rural site where items linked to Mara were recovered, including fabric fibers matching her clothing and an acrylic nail fragment consistent with her grooming habits. The prosecution stressed that no reasonable explanation existed for Mara's belongings to appear at the same location as Calvin's DNA, unless he had been there with her during the unexplained gap in his 2009 timeline. Cell tower analysis reports followed, proving Calvin's phone had stopped in the exact area where Mara's items were later found. The prosecution argued that the convergence of cell tower data, physical items, and camera footage was not random coincidence, but a single logical sequence, leading to the conclusion that Calvin had taken Mara to that location the night she disappeared. These elements were placed alongside Calvin's history of contradictory statements, denying he left home, denying anyone was in his truck, denying he was ever at the rural site, all flatly disproven by modern evidence. The prosecution contended that the persistent inconsistencies and decade-long concealment demonstrated clear intent to cover up criminal conduct. From this data chain, the prosecution concluded that Calvin had caused Mara's death, whether intentionally or through reckless behavior that rose to a criminal level, and that the absence of a body could not negate the overwhelming weight of the forensic logic. In response, the defense built its case around a single powerful point: without a body, there was no absolute proof Mara was even dead. Calvin's attorney argued that everything the prosecution presented was mere speculation, asserting that touch DNA could be contaminated. Items in the soil could have been moved by wind or animals, and the grainy camera images could be misinterpreted. The defense focused on the requirement for direct evidence, contending that the law must rely on proof rather than inference, and that the lack of a body prevented the charge from meeting the burden of proof in a criminal homicide case. In rebuttal, the prosecution dismissed this argument by citing numerous no-body homicide precedents from other U.S. jurisdictions, affirming that the law does not require a body for conviction when the circumstantial chain is sufficiently strong and cohesive. They emphasized that every piece of physical, forensic, signal, and behavioral evidence pointed to one conclusion, and no plausible innocent scenario could account for the entire data set. When the case went to the jury, they faced the difficult task of evaluating a murder trial without a body, but with a tightly interlocked chain of circumstantial evidence that continuously reinforced itself. The jurors were instructed to determine whether the prosecution's logical arrangement, Calvin's DNA at the scene, the victim's personal items buried in the soil, restored camera images, the empty timeline window, and Calvin's false statements formed a reasonable, consistent, and overwhelmingly persuasive whole that outweighed any innocent explanation. In weighing each piece, the jury had to decide whether reasonable doubt of Calvin's innocence truly remained, or whether the prosecution had met the standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Their decision rested not on isolated fragments, but on how those fragments interlocked to paint a complete picture of what happened the night Mara Ellison vanished. A picture with internal logic, forensic depth, and persuasive force that the defense's no-body argument could not dismantle. When the jury completed deliberations and was called back into the Lancaster County courtroom, the atmosphere became so tense that every sound was swallowed by silence. This was the decisive moment of a 10-year no-body homicide case in which the entire effort of the cold case unit, prosecutors, forensic experts, and investigators converged into one instant: the verdict for Calvin Rhodes. When the judge asked the jury to announce their decision, the foreperson stood, held the verdict form, and read clearly: "We, the jury, find the defendant Calvin Rhodes guilty of second-degree murder." There was no outburst, no crying out. Only a heavy silence, as if the entire courtroom were holding its breath. With this verdict, Mara Ellison's disappearance was officially classified as a homicide, even though her body had never been recovered. The charge against Calvin Rhodes was second-degree murder under Nebraska law, which carries sentencing for unlawfully causing the death of another person without premeditation, but with intent or through reckless conduct that demonstrates extreme indifference to human life. Unlike first-degree murder, which requires proof of planning or premeditation, second-degree murder focuses on actions where the perpetrator was aware their conduct could cause death, yet proceeded anyway. The prosecution had argued that the evidentiary chain, Calvin's DNA at the scene, items directly tied to Mara, buried in the soil, cell tower data confirming the stop location, enhanced camera images, and a decade of false statements showed he caused Mara's death during a sudden altercation, followed by transporting her to the rural area and concealing the aftermath. Under Nebraska law, second-degree murder carries a sentencing range of a minimum of 20 years imprisonment to a maximum of life. This gives the judge discretion to set the specific term based on the crime's severity, concealment efforts, the defendant's attitude, and aggravating factors in cases involving strong circumstantial evidence. Despite no body, higher sentences within the range are common. After the jury verdict, the court moved to formal sentencing. The prosecution reiterated aggravating factors. Calvin not only caused Mara's death, but concealed evidence, gave deliberately false statements for 10 years, stalled the initial investigation, and inflicted prolonged psychological harm on the victim's family. They stressed that, without advances in forensic technology, the persistence of the cold case unit, and modern analytical methods, the case might never have been solved, underscoring the danger posed by Calvin's prolonged deception. The defense requested the minimum sentence within the range, arguing that the absence of a body made the exact circumstances of Mara's death unclear and therefore the maximum penalty inappropriate. The judge rejected this argument. In delivering the sentence, the judge explained that the crime lay not only in causing death, but in the sustained, deliberate concealment and repeated attempts to mislead authorities, forcing the victim's family to live in limbo for a decade. He emphasized that the lack of a body did not lessen the gravity of the offense, since the defendant himself was the reason that crucial evidence could not be recovered. When the judge pronounced the final sentence, the courtroom fell completely silent. The court sentences the defendant Calvin Rhodes to a term of 35 years to life imprisonment under the Nebraska second-degree murder sentencing framework. The 35-to-life sentence reflected the case's severity, a consistent evidentiary chain, prolonged concealment, and continuous efforts to obstruct the investigation. It far exceeded the minimum and approached the upper end of the statutory range, signaling the court's view that permanently removing a victim, even without recovering the body, warranted severe punishment. Following sentencing, Calvin Rhodes was transferred to the Nebraska State Penitentiary, the state's highest security facility, to begin serving his sentence. There he became an inmate serving an indeterminate life term, meaning he has no fixed release date, and any future release will depend entirely on the parole board's assessment, if it ever occurs. Calvin was escorted from the courtroom in silence, with no dramatic reaction, but the heavy atmosphere made clear the profound impact of the judgment. A disappearance stalled for 10 years had finally received legal closure, and the Nebraska community at last had an answer regarding the fate of Mara Ellison. The 35 years to life sentence, handed down to Calvin Rhodes, closed a nearly year-long reinvestigation, but at the same time opened a comprehensive review phase of the entire case-breaking journey. A journey that began with the unsolved disappearance in 2009 and only reached resolution when 2019, forensic technology finally allowed scattered fragments of data to be pieced together into a complete chain of evidence. When the Lancaster County Sheriff's Office compiled its final report, it divided the entire process into clear phases to identify which factors proved decisive. The initial investigation phase, with large-scale searches but lacking technology. The stalled phase, that led to the case being transferred to cold case. And finally the 2019 reactivation phase, driven by advances in trace forensic DNA and image enhancement technology. The final report states unequivocally that if investigators had been limited to the original 2009 data, evidence fragments that were too small, surveillance video that was too blurry, and cell tower data that was too imprecise, the case might never have been solved. Only when 2019 forensic technology was applied did items previously deemed legally insufficient become the cornerstone of the investigation. Touch DNA technique successfully isolated. Calvin's biological traces in areas he had denied ever visiting, trace analysis methods identified skin cells and materials that matched Mara's clothing and personal items, and video enhancement technology clearly revealed the presence of a passenger in the front seat of Calvin's vehicle. A detail that directly contradicted his statements for an entire decade. The intersection of forensic data and enhanced imagery created the breakthrough that neither element could have achieved alone. The report also highlights the role of modern cell tower analysis. Although the original 2009 data had low accuracy, 2019 algorithms were able to reconstruct a geographic movement timeline and pinpoint a stop made by Calvin's phone that coincided exactly with the location where Mara's belongings were later recovered. It was precisely the combination of multiple data sources, DNA, surveillance footage, soil layer physical evidence, and cell signal records, that transformed the case from a chain of hypotheses into a consistent chain of proof with no logical gaps large enough for the defense to exploit. Nebraska investigators now regard the Mara Ellison case as a model of technology-integrated investigation where no single piece of evidence was decisive on its own, yet the small fragments, when placed together, formed an unassailable legal structure. As a direct result, the case has influenced how police departments across Nebraska evaluate and handle missing persons reports. Many agencies in the state now use the Mara Ellison file as a case study to establish protocols that prioritize the preservation of trace evidence even when current technology cannot yet analyze it. The report recommends that every missing persons case, even those without initial signs of criminal activity, must collect evidence to the highest forensic standards possible for future analysis, because technology can advance faster than investigators at the scene can predict. Additionally, the case prompted changes to surveillance video management procedures statewide. Instead of simply extracting and visually reviewing footage, video must now be preserved in uncompressed format to enable future enhancement techniques. Furthermore, prosecutors across Nebraska now place greater emphasis on the viability of prosecution in no-body homicide cases, viewing the Mara Ellison conviction as important precedent proving that a body is not required to prosecute murder as long as the circumstantial chain meets the beyond a reasonable doubt threshold. The case has been incorporated into the training curriculum of several law schools in the state as a textbook example of effective circumstantial argumentation where the interconnectivity of the data matters more than the individual origin of any single piece of evidence. At the community level, the case has profoundly affected how Nebraska residents perceive long-term missing persons cases. Many families with loved ones who disappeared years ago have proactively contacted the cold case unit, requesting that their files be re-examined in light of new technology, placing far greater hope in resolution than they did a decade earlier. Ultimately, the investigative summary emphasizes that the Mara Ellison case is not merely the story of a nobody murder, but clear proof that the combination of modern forensic technology, persistent investigative procedure, and the integration of data from multiple sources can break any deadlock. The precedent now stands as one of the most significant no-body homicide cases in Nebraska history, reshaping the justice system's view of the value of circumstantial evidence and setting a solid foundation for similar cases in the future. The story of the Mara Ellison case, prosecuted in 2019 after a decade of deadlock, carries a major lesson for American society today: the truth will never reveal itself if people give up. And personal safety is something that must be actively protected rather than left to chance. The fact that Mara vanished after an argument with her boyfriend Calvin Rhodes in a sparsely populated suburban area, an environment typical of many states across the U.S., from Nebraska to Iowa or Kansas, reminds us that conflict in intimate relationships can escalate to serious danger if warning signs are not recognized in time. Red flags such as Calvin's controlling behavior, contradictory statements, and attempts to isolate Mara from family and friends are indicators that many women in the United States still face today in toxic relationships. Another profound lesson comes from the way modern forensic technology, touch DNA, video enhancement, cell tower analysis, finally cracked the case after 10 years. This reflects the reality that every one of us, when we have information, suspicion, or evidence of violent behavior, should report it as early as possible, because data preserved today can become the key to solving a case many years later. More than 90% of intimate violence victims in America do not report immediately, and Mara's case shows how that delay can turn a dangerous situation into tragedy. Finally, the 35 years to life sentence handed to Calvin also sends a clear message: the American justice system may work slowly, but when the pieces of evidence finally come together, justice can still be served, even in a no-body homicide. For communities across the country today, the most important takeaway is never downplay signs of relationship violence. Always report when a loved one goes missing under suspicious circumstances, and trust that technology combined with community persistence can deliver answers no matter how long it takes. Thank you for following the entire arduous case-breaking journey of Mara Ellison's disappearance. If you want to keep exploring in-depth investigation stories like this one, please remember to subscribe to the channel. See you in the next video, where we'll continue examining real cases that have shaken America.